Hello there. Here is my video to summarise my last year's costs for running my own same-day courier business based primarily off the CX. And the context for this is that I'm a single owner driver with one long wheelbase van. It's a Ford Transit van, medium height, long length. It's quite an old van. It is coming to the end of its life now. And I've got the figures, so the video I did last year compared to my figures for 2025. These are all figures that are based on a calendar year, so they're all from January to December of the particular year that we're looking at. And these figures aren't absolutely the same as my tax return, because my tax return is based on an April to March time period. So there'll be slight variations, but basically the figures that I'm showing you here are a really good example of what you would expect to spend as your fixed costs on doing a business for yourself. The first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows, I would classify them all as being costs for your van. And then I've got other costs in order of priority. So my CX membership for me is absolutely vital. I need to have a mobile phone for business. I need to have a business bank account. So those three, I would say everyone should have those if you're going to work in the same way as I do. You don't actually have to have an accountant, but I think personally it's much more useful, and I save a lot of money by doing that. Postage, that's negligible. Printing and stationery is negligible. And miscellaneous expenses would cover things in this case like any equipment that I replace, or maybe any fines that I have to pay for parking fines, or maybe historically but not recently that would have included my credit card fees for having a credit card debt. You can see, for example, that in the last year it's £247, and that was when I had my credit card debt. And then this £37 is much less. Some of that is down to like a month or two of the last credit card being paid off. So I'll run through as a comparison my first full year compared to my second full year. Just for full disclosure, I started doing this job as a self-employed same-day courier in March of 2023. So I'm actually on my third set of full year accounts coming up this March, and I have got on my next spreadsheet, which I'm going to show you, 3 columns with some stats, which I'll do in another video. This is just the calendar years 2024 compared to 2025. So let's run through them. The road tax is very similar. I've got £15 more in the last year than the year before. The van insurance is very similar again, only £30 increase year on year. My MOT and repairs bill is significantly different. In my 2024 figures, it's 4,400 more or less, and it was a lot less, 2,600 last year. That's based on having 4 services in a year and any repairs that my van needs, getting them done as required. There was a couple more bigger items in the first year than last year, but basically you can see that I'm spending sort of 2,500 to 4,500 a year on repairing and maintaining my van, and that's because I have an old van. It's 10 years old now this year, 2026. So it is an old van. It is going to need more maintenance and repairs than a newer van would do. It does a lot of miles, but it serves me really well. If you were going to do this and compare your own figures, you might have a lot lower expectation for your MOT and repairs costs, because you might have a 2 or 3 year old van, in which case it could be a lot less. It won't be, if you're going to do 4 services, you're probably looking at least £1,000, if not 1,500 for that, depending on how seriously you take your servicing. So it's not going to be a negligible. It's going to be a cost that you need to take into account. but you might have figures that are lower than mine. So the next column is my van recovery membership. A slight difference because I had to do the first year as an emergency sign up, so I got a bit of a deal the second year. And then finally, this is something I like to talk about. This is my van savings, and this is very much a theoretical number. I put it in primarily to kind of give a realistic expectation about what you should take into account of when it comes to the costs of running this business. Now, I wasn't in a position in the last 2 years to actually save £3,500 towards my next van. That's based on a figure of £300 per month. If you're going to do this business, that should be something you account for in some way. You might account for it in a slightly different way. You might get your van on hire purchase, in which case you might get the same figure, but you're paying the van off, having borrowed the money through the van dealership to do that. I don't like doing that. I prefer to have the money up front if I can. So for me, if I can save £300 a month, that means over the course of a life of a van, I've got enough money saved up to pay for the next van. I'll come back to that when I talk about my budget for the year coming up. But that's basically why it's there in the spreadsheets. My CX membership went up slightly. This would have been my second payment to them because my first payment was done in 2023. That was an annual amount, one-off fee, whereas the second figure on here for last year was when I started doing a quarterly direct debit. So that's what it comes to now for me. I don't know if next year it'll be higher. I'm going to talk about budgeting in a moment. But that's what it cost me. And again, these are figures that exclude VAT. Just to explain that, I exclude VAT because I'm VAT registered, so I can claim back all the VAT that I pay out, which I do once a quarter. So whatever I spend money on to do with my business, all the VAT I reclaim based off the difference between what I've received in VAT receipts compared to what I paid out in VAT payments. And then I give the government the difference, the balance of that. If I was to spend a lot more on VAT than my receipts, I'd get a refund from the government. For example, if I was to buy a van and spend, a few £1,000s on VAT, I would never receive that amount over the course of a quarter. So I'd end up getting a refund if I was to buy a van, a reasonably good van. So at the moment, I've never been in a situation where that's happened, but so far, I'm really pleased with being VAT registered. It's been really useful for me. Next is my mobile phone for work. So I've basically had, these are actual figures in the calendar year. It went up slightly over time. It always does. It has a slight increase. So 119 compared to £123. Negligible, I would say. My business bank account, I pay £8.50 a month for that. And so it was not going up in this period. It's £102 both years. My accountancy and Xero charges. So Xero is the software that I use. I find it really useful, saves me a lot of time, and it makes looking at reporting quite easy. These figures all came off a reporting I did from Xero. They're really easy to collect, and so I find it just a great time saver and puts me in control of my finances. It's not for everyone. People work differently with their business, but for me, having an accountant that I can rely on to do all the sort of grunt work, and then having Xero that I can then use and find out information for myself, it's just perfect. So it's well worth the money I spend. It's sort of £818 the first year, £840 the second year. It will go up every year. It's part of what inflation involves with us in this business. And the next three are kind of minor expenses. I spent £60 in the first year on postage, although not all of that was spent in that year. Some of those stamps were spent in 2025. I spent £28 therefore in 2025, and my printing and stationery is things like envelopes, paper, printer ink, that sort of thing, and that came to £50 and £73. And then finally, miscellaneous expenses, which I've already spoken about. They are very minor. Last year, down to £37, mainly down to, as I said, lack of credit card interest payments that I was paying in 2025. So those are all the things that I spend to run my business, and therefore the total amount, and these are what I'd call my fixed costs, my total amount of fixed costs came to £11,150 in 2025. And that's the amount of money that I would spend just on having a van and just having it sit on the drive, being able to use the CX and having it all insured. I've converted that to a weekly amount, which is 265. That's not based on 52 weeks, though. That's based on this figure up here, 42 weeks, which is what I can realistically work at the moment. I won't talk about the reason why it's quite so low in this video. There's on my channel with my other videos, I talk about what's going on in my life. This is just about the money side. So moving down to the variable costs, again excluding VAT, these are things that the more that I work, the more they cost me. So the first row is my corporation tax bill. So these are actual figures, the actual amounts that I had to pay. So in 2024 it was £3,278, which was quite a big shock and quite difficult for me to find. The tax year I've just had, it was £821, which is a lot more manageable. So the reason for that is that I earned less money over the course of the year. So it's not necessarily good to pay that much corporation tax. I'd rather earn more money, but as it was, that's what it came to last year. I've taken out of this, for the figures, the fuel costs, but I will put those back in a moment. And the reason why I've left them out is because although I have spent a lot of money on fuel, the way that I do my stats each day and each week is based on looking at my net figures after taking into account fuel. So I wanted to do this spreadsheet for the purposes of the last bit, excluding my fuel, but I'll come back to that at the end. Then I've got my tolls. Obviously, the more I work, the more I'm going to spend on tolls. So that's the figures there, £31, £97 for the previous year. And that gives me a new total for the fixed variable cost of £852 and a new weekly amount based on that of £20. So if I add the two totals together, my total business costs comes to £12,002. And that's quite a round number, isn't it? It's £1,000 a month, as you can see at the end. And that also comes to £286 per week. If you look back at my videos for the last year, when I've said at the end of the week that my weekly income is, I don't know, £600, let's say, or £500, you then take off this weekly amount, £286, and that's what I've got left to pay for my own personal expenses. Now, if you were aware, last year I was basing it on £315 because that was the figure that it came to. And you can see that the actual figure was less in 2025. So I actually would have had slightly more personal income than I was expecting because I was taking off £315 every week, not £286. Right, and then going back to the fuel, if I just add in the two fuel amounts, you can see that in the first year it was basically £7,900, and I spent a bit less this year, in the last year, £7,200. So that's the actual amount I've spent all in. So when you look now at the total amounts for running a business, it was 19,000, say 200 in the last year compared to 24,000, say 300. So roughly a £5,000 difference in from one year to the next. So I'm pretty pleased I've managed to save £5,000 worth of expenditure over that year. And that'll be because I've done things slightly differently or I've made different decisions. Yeah, but I did less London work, so less fines. I'd done a lot of the work that needed my van in the first year, not the second year. So by thinking ahead, you get over a period of time some savings. That exists there for you to understand how much does it cost to run a long wheelbase van on the CX as a single owner driver. Next bit of this video is about budgeting, so forecasting for the future. In this column now, I've put in a set of figures that cover what I expect the cost to be in the upcoming year. So I'm looking at this as being, looking ahead, what will I need to cover each of those items. So just running through them very quickly. Road tax is an extra £10 this year, I know that for a fact. My van insurance cost won't be due until the end of August, so I'm just guessing a similar increase over last year of £30. I've put £3,000 as my estimate for my repairs and MOT based on 4 services in the year. And I think that's a realistic amount to have there. I may spend less or I may spend more. In terms of my van, just on a slight aside, I'm looking to get at least a year to 18 months more use out of this van. So I would spend that sort of money to keep it on the road. And I'll come to the plan in a moment as to why I've got that time scale. The next is my recovery membership, which is not due until October, but I've put on a slight increase over this year's of 1 to 175. Right, van savings. Now, this is where this figure over here of £400 comes into play. If I was to change that to £300, you'll see when I press enter, this figure go down to the same as the previous year. So 3,600. But I really want to be in a position where I can afford a new van a year from now. So if I'm able to save £400 a month, I'll end up with close to £5,000 extra in my savings account for my van. And I've looked at vans this January, and I've decided that if I can get an extra £5,000 in my savings account, I can afford a decent van to replace the one I've got. And I am going to hope that I can save that much, and I'm going to plan to have that in place this time next year. In which case, I'll have enough money to buy a new van if I need to at that point. Not a new van, so a second-hand van, but it'll be a newish second-hand van. I can probably afford a 1-year-old van at that point. I'm certainly not going to be spending money on a new van. That would be a complete waste of my money. And I've decided there's an amount of money that I'm prepared to spend on a van for my work. And there's an amount below that which I'm happy to pay, and above that which I'm not happy to pay. I'm not going to tell you what that figure is yet, but I'm £5,000 away from the upper figure. So that's where that money comes from. Anything beyond that £5,000, I wouldn't feel it's worth me spending that much money on a one-off purchase to buy a van. Bearing in mind my age and my health, and what it's like to do this job in terms of the difficulty of finding work, it's not worth me putting all my eggs into that particular basket. So I've made a decision that what I've got in the bank now plus 5,000 is the most I'm prepared to invest in a van. And that would be a van that would need to last me kind of 8 to 10 years, in which case I'd be a lot closer to retirement at that point, and then I could then decide what's happening. But I am looking to get another long wheelbase van. Not going to get a Luton. I'm not going to get an extra long wheelbase. I'm not going to go lower. I think the van size I've got is perfect for me. It takes 3 full-size pallets, and I'm happy with that. That's what I want to try and save. I think that's quite ambitious. So if I earn, let's say, £3,000 less next year than I wanted to, well, I've still got £1,800 towards my new van. It is very much a buffer between what I want to happen and what actually ends up happening. Right, my CX, I don't know what it's going to be, but I've put down 1,500 as a slight increase. My mobile phone, I put down a slight increase of 144. I'm just guessing here. It won't be a lot higher. It might not be even higher at all. But we're getting to quite minor expenses now. I don't think my business bank account is going to change at all, so I put the same figure in. I put a slight increase to £900 for my Xero and accountancy. My postage is completely guessed. It's £30. That could be a bit under, but it's not going to be a lot under. I do less because of the Smart Pay system now on CX. There's less and less companies that rely on postage. I found, at least the ones I work for don't rely on it so much. Printing and stationery, just a guess there, £80, just to cover whatever comes up. And then finally, I put £100 as a sort of budget for my miscellaneous expenses. That won't be probably needed, but if I needed a new, I don't know, new high vis or some new straps, but that would cover that. So it could be a lot more if I was to go if I was to get a new mobile phone, for example, it'd be probably at least double that. So the total for my budget for this year is 13,000 and a bit more pounds, which is very similar to what I ended up spending in 2024, which is 30,011. My variable costs, excluding fuel, because it's going to be around about the £7,000 to £7,500 figure, but I always base my weekly results net of fuel, so I'm going to ignore it in this in here. So I've guessed at corporation tax as being 2,000, and I've guessed at my tolls as being 50 for the year. So that brings me a total of 2,050 to add on to my total. So my grand total for the year coming up to run my business, I think it's going to take £15,086. So that's what I'm budgeting. That's what I'm sort of aiming towards. If I then work that out as a weekly amount, it's £359 over a 42-week period. If I was to change that to 44 weeks, that would go down. But I'm going to be realistic here and say I probably can't work much more than 42 weeks. At least that's what I'm going to base it on. So 42 weeks working, I need to earn, let's say, £360 every single week that I work. Last year, just as a kind of comparison, I had £315 as the figure. But that was based on 52 weeks in the year, not the weeks that I worked. So that's why that figure's a little bit lower. I think that's the figure I need to be working to, is how many weeks am I going to work? Of those working weeks, how much do I need to earn just to cover my business expenses? So in my videos this year, I'll be quoting £360 as my fixed business costs after fuel. And that's where that figure comes from. And then my monthly amount is going to be £1,257. And that's where, when I do my monthly figures, that figure comes from. So I'm going to bring this video to a close. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask me. That is just a video to show how much it costs to run my van and my budget for the upcoming year. Cheers.